Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Greetings to everyone tuning in today, and also to those of you who will be watching this in the future. Welcome to GDDF 2024. We have been live for about 5 hours now and are delighted to have you with us. My name is Manisha Aryal, and I'm the Global Practice Lead for Digital Development at Chemonics, where I work on issues of digital access and inclusion, and with programs across sectors to leverage digital for development impact. Our keynote conversation today is with Anup Kaphle, Editor-in-Chief of Rest of World. Anup's been with the Rest of World since its early days in 2020, and before that, he worked with a range of publications, including BuzzFeed News, The Washington Post, Roads and Kingdoms, and Kathmandu Post. Fun fact, when I plugged this session on LinkedIn a few days ago, a few people messaged me and asked if I had tried his kalo masuku recipe. I have not yet, but for those culinarily adventurous amongst us and willing to cook with mustard oil, cloves, fenugreek seeds, and asafoetida, please look up Black and Goat on his blog, Anup's Kitchen. Rest of World is unique in its approach, and in the short time it has been around, has become an indispensable news source that captures people's experiences with technology outside the West. Let's begin this conversation by watching a 30-second video about Rest of World, and then we'll go into our conversation with Anup.
Have you ever heard the term rest of world? It's corporate speak in global business operations. Basically, it means everyone else. The billions of people who don't live in the Western world. Never mind all them. The rest of the world. Who needs it? But what if, maybe, you didn't buy into the ridiculous jargon? What if tech journalism didn't just cover guys like him, but her, and her, and him? What if cryptocurrency legislation in Lagos was also the answer in Bangalore? Maybe what they're making in a back room here will determine how you order your food here, or how much the government keeps tabs on you here. Because in this rest of world, what happens here matters here, and yeah, here too. So sure, maybe it's just meaningless jargon. Or maybe what's in a name matters. See what you've been missing at restofworld.org.
So, Anup, welcome to the Global Digital Development Forum. I know it is very early for you in San Diego, where you are attending another conference. Thank you for getting up early in the morning to have this conversation. We really appreciate it.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. So the media globally is facing challenges, and tech journalism is also a very crowded space, right? You know this better than me. You've worked at the Kathmandu Post and you've worked at the Washington Post. So let's begin at the beginning itself. Why the rest of world? What does rest of world bring to journalism or global coverage that isn't out there already?
So, tech journalism has historically just focused on business and gadgetry, and even though there is still a significant section that focuses narrowly on the business of tech, in large part we're seeing improvement in terms of how technology shapes social, political, cultural, and economic life. At Rest of World, we're trying to solve two things: the gap in technology reporting in much of the world we cover, we're calling Rest of World, right, the emerging markets, and then save for a handful of publications that are doing some smart coverage of technology, like Tech Cabal in Nigeria or the Ken in India. There's not really a lot of dedicated tech coverage in most of the emerging markets. And we want to both teach journalists, local journalists in these communities, how to write about technology by weaving narratives about its impact on local lives, and also let them tell us why these stories matter. And we want the tech stories to be also reflective of the communities we cover. That means we're approaching stories at the intersection of issues that are integral to specific regions, whether those are stories about tech and labor in East Asia, or tech and politics in Latin America, or tech and religion in South Asia. And we're leaning as much as possible on the unintended consequences of technology, whether it's a local platform that is born out of necessity or something that Silicon Valley companies decided makes sense for that community. And what we bring to the table is perspective from these places we cover. in little over 4 years. We launched in 2020, right as COVID was peaking. We've reported on more than 1,500 stories from over 100 countries, and the majority of these stories, I would say like 95 plus, they're reported by local journalists in their home countries. We have a growing loyal audience that tells us we're filling this crucial gap, and they appreciate, they admire, and they support our work.
Wow, 4 years and 100 countries, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, I guess, right? Can you talk about what you're seeing in terms of tech trends? Like, how do you decide what to focus on, or how you cover them, and how do you identify these emerging trends?
So our coverage has evolved since our launch, but the basics of what we cover remains the same, which is impact of technology on everyday lives. In the beginning, when we launched, our goal was to solidify our proof of concept, obviously, because something like this didn't exist. So we were quite broad. We divided our coverage into four big buckets. It was how people buy, how people work, how people communicate and share information, or misinformation, and how Silicon Valley impacts countries around the world. And by now, year four, we not only have a clear sense of what types of stories our audience wants to read, but also what areas are emerging as the most consequential issues in technology. And so at the moment, we're focusing on themes like EV revolution, where we go deeper into who's leading the transformation when it comes to electric mobility in emerging markets, right? We're covering the rise of AI, where we look into what does the AI implementation and impact actually look like outside the West. We're also covering one of the beats I'm super excited about is called China Outside China, in which we look at the innovation of Chinese tech and the role and influence of China and Chinese technology in the global tech ecosystem. And then, we do a lot of regional champions, which is basically sort of like writing about the innovation of local tech companies, the Flipkarts of India or the Rapids of Latin America. And then, like, I think in addition to a lot of these beats, we're doing intersectional coverage within the beats. For example, since our founding, we've invested a lot of resources to covering the intersection of labor and tech, focusing on startup models that have transformed the nature of work. We write a lot about gig workers, right? Because startup tech, by nature, gig workers become one of those models in tech that's dominant around the world. And our dedication to covering that space actually got us a Ford grant to double down on the impact of tech on both work, right, and workers. So we're essentially sort of like looking at patterns of like, what is actually happening on the ground? How is tech shaping people's lives? How is it impacting people? But broadly through these topics at the moment.
That's and how do you find reporters?
We find it the traditional way. We're looking for writers who have experience writing in English, right? They may not necessarily have experience covering technology. So sometimes in certain places, right, if you're like, trying to find writers in Zimbabwe, a lot of freelance writers are used to doing general news, covering politics, for global organizations like Al Jazeera Vice. So you're training them to kind of like write about technology. Other times, if you're going to a place like India, it's slightly easier because there is a healthy kind of like media ecosystem covering business and technology to some degree. But because we sort of practice a slightly different kind of technology reporting, which is again putting people at the center, right, thinking about impact, trying the narrative approach. There's a bit of like a learning curve, teaching curve to this thing. But yeah, we have editors who are based in those countries, so they are looking for freelancers in the countries that they cover. We're on the ground. We're looking for writers. We put out calls all the time.
And what are you seeing in terms of the rise of AI?
I think like one of the things we are seeing, there is a lot of talk when you talk about AI, especially in this election year. Everybody's been talking in terms of misinformation and disinformation, and just like the floodgates have opened, and it's just going to be a disaster. a day. But we launched this election tracker actually 3 months ago to aggregate instances of AI-related misinformation and disinformation in countries that are holding elections this year, right? And I'll come back to this in a little bit, but like my experience covering AI at Rest of the World, let's say even over the last 6 months, is there's a lot of focus here in Silicon Valley about like AI doomsday, like what does it mean for work, like is it going to take over our lives? But I think like in a lot of the places we cover, whether it's Kenya, India, there's actually that's where the real impact is because a lot of these Silicon Valley companies are hiring people to build you know language models, large language models. So a lot of the legwork, just the way there was focus in the Philippines and India to hire content moderators by social media companies back in the day, right? They're looking for workers to sort of input data to do a lot of the legwork for these large language models. And then, so that's sort of like one practical thing we're seeing. In terms of actually AI misinformation, disinformation, one of our editors wrote in his analysis a couple of weeks ago, uh, even though in this tracker, we were able to verify that AI has been used in various posts that are going up on TikTok, that are going on Facebook, that are going on Twitter. It is often harder to classify most of the cases as misinformation or disinformation, right? In the case of India, for example, just concluded its elections. We saw things like dead politicians resurrected to campaign for their children who are running in the office this year, or like famous Bollywood actors were presented as endorsing a party or politicians, but the majority of them were just done in jest. So there is a lot of parody and not a lot of malice. That's kind of like our initial conclusion. The real harm obviously continues to be in terms of the rhetoric that is spread on social media platforms. And it's funny, like I would call social media platforms traditional at this point because we're talking so much about AI. And that kind of misinformation has been spreading for the past decade plus, and so much of it continues to go unchecked. The bad news is platforms haven't figured out how to successfully identify these kind of AI generated content and then label them for caution. Um, but the good news is that like what we're seeing in terms of AI related content is actually significantly less dangerous, right? Now, of course, all of this will evolve. And I could be completely wrong by this fall. Like U.S. elections are coming up. We're seeing a lot of this kind of content posted here in the U.S. We have elections coming up in the UK and France. But if India is any indication, even with the flooding of deep fakes, it wasn't really a crisis in terms of misinformation that many had said it would be.
Interesting. So how can people use the disinformation tracker? Can this be used by other people as well?
Yeah, so we built it. I mean, it's actually a pretty simple concept. We have a team of like editors and reporters who are, looking online every single day and trying to find patterns, trying to find the type of posts that use AI to create content, right? And then we're trying to dissect them. We're telling people like where we found it, how it was posted, what does it do, and what is the misinformation, disinformation in that thing. We're also asking readers to help us find those kind of things because a lot of these things are spreading on platforms like WhatsApp, platforms like TikTok. So share with us like what you're seeing and we will do our reporting and incorporate it in part of a tracker. And we hope it can kind of like be a research tool. We will continue doing it throughout the year. We're covering other elections. Obviously we're India was the big one, but we're monitoring several other elections in the regions that we cover, and we hope it can kind of like be a library of these instances that we're finding from around the world.
Awesome. So we have a question from Sulakshana Gupta. So let me ask that here because it seems like a good place to ask that question. Do you face issues with writers using AI tools to write their pieces? How do you feel about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think like again, because as I mentioned earlier, like there's a bit of training component in how we're asking, how we expect our writers to report and write. And there is a layer of sort of like this unspoken trust between editors and writers, right? And because we kind of know the people we're working with, um, I don't think there are any surprises. But what we have said, kind of unofficially, is that we don't want people trying to sort of generate entire paragraphs of stories, using AI tools. I think there is a research component that's absolutely sort of fine to do, but then you have to check those, right? We have a fact checking apparatus where we check sensitive stories. We encourage people to use the tools to aid their reporting, but not entirely rely on them. And I think that's really sort of what we can do at this moment. We can use things like that to see whether we can figure out what the audience wants, right? Like where we can write heads and decks, and we can probably write summaries. We haven't done that at Rest of the World, but I know that's how a lot of journalism publications are using it these days. But just in terms of reporting, I think it is not a significant part of the process for us right now.
Okay, so Michelle Yao asks, in your view, how does misinformation spread differently in the West versus the rest of the world? For example, in South and Southeast Asia, WhatsApp forwarding of fake news is rampant and hard to control. No way to report the misinformation or to add labels on it. So how does this look in the different parts of the world?
Yeah, I don't know if there is kind of like a huge difference, except that I think, WhatsApp, even though a very, very Western platforms, kind of, the dominant messaging platform in South Asia, I wake up to dozens and dozens of messages in these WhatsApp groups. It's also so common. I think okay, the one difference is it's really common to have people's phone numbers in I want to say our parts of the world, but in South Asia, right? Like in parts of Africa, like you communicate through phone numbers. You randomly get phone calls from people, right? Like who will find your phone numbers. So there is just like that easy access to another individual, and people are sharing information that way. I think what's happening in the West is there is a mix of a lot of actual fake sites. There is like intentional misinformation and fake news sites cropping up. And then there's just generally sort of people amplifying it, sometimes through mainstream channels, right? Even broadcast channels, because there's a lot of sort of like the two-sided journalism, like analysis, opinion thing that happens in the West. And I think it's more people driven in the West, the common people driven, relatives, family members, right? Through platforms like WhatsApp. And then I think in the West, it feels like, it feels more organized, it feels more polished, and it's happening through mainstream channels as well.
So I think there's one more question along the same line, and that is from Jessica Swan. How do you think that social media platforms are incentivized to detect and flag misinformation, deepfakes, especially if they are generating engagement on the platforms?
And I think, are they incentivized? Probably not, right? Like we've seen real failure over the last decade in terms of how platforms are handling misinformation and disinformation. I think fast forward, what it looked like in 2014, it doesn't look the same in 2024. We're seeing platforms like Facebook that actually do a pretty good job, compared to the days of what was happening in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, right? They are pretty good about moderating, especially material in the West, right? But sometimes they overcorrect when they're doing content moderation for things outside the West. And I think the Israel-Palestine thing is a really good example. Sometimes they're trying to censor the word Hamas, regardless of how it appears, right? But at the same time, they're not paying attention to the posts in Hebrew, right? And so there is a lot of hateful language and stuff that's going on in that language. If you look at platforms like Twitter, ever since Elon Musk bought the platform, the trust and safety teams, the content moderation teams, they've been decimated, and basically a lot of the misinformation, disinformation just flies, every day on those platforms. TikTok doesn't incentivize news. They pretty much suppress news. So there is a lot of misinformation, disinformation that's happening there. And I think platforms want to do a good job, but it's sort of, it goes unchecked every single day. And the effort that they put in terms of engaging people around the world, that doesn't equal the effort that they're putting in terms of finding ways to check these kind of misinformation, disinformation on their platforms.
Right. So moving away a little bit from misinformation and disinformation and going to sort of like larger tech again, what are you seeing in terms of the world that you cover that you're most hopeful about? What are emerging tech trends that we should sort of like, keep an eye out on? What might be the next big story? What's coming out of the world you cover?
I mean, so one of the reasons I was drawn to this idea of rest of world was because it is an opportunity to talk about what is hopeful, right? And what is working in our part of the world. And I use our part of the world because deep inside, I'm very Nepali. I care about Nepal and countries like ours. So, historically, these regions, these parts of the world have been often portrayed as broken, failed, developing world, especially when it comes to technology. The point we're trying to make is that the world of innovation is bigger than Silicon Valley, right? Every year, there are billion-dollar ideas that are emerging from outside the West, resulting in new companies that are transforming the regions they're in. So, when we talk about what are we seeing, we're like, whether it's a Kareem in Pakistan that became incredibly successful and is one of the most prominent ride hailing platforms across the Middle East and South Asia, or a company like Flipkart in India, which Walmart has a stake in and competes with Amazon, right? Or Nubank in Brazil, which is the world's largest like Nubank, or Flutterwave in Nigeria, right? These companies, they're forced to build amid so much political instability, economic uncertainty, and like very opaque, broken, inconsistent systems. And these companies are still succeeding in that environment. And in many cases, they're giving Western companies a tough competition. Last year, we published a project that highlighted some of this success. We looked at 40 companies that are beating the West. Now, again, we're using the terms beating like loosely, even though we have punching gloves in the project there. Right? In terms of how are they excelling in terms of ideas, execution, user adoption. So I think, even amid all the gloom about technology in the world, we think we can write about what it takes to succeed for companies outside the West, and that's the bright spot, right? And what does failure cost in these environments? For founders, for investors, for mass public, and what does it mean to miss out on these technology trends outside? Because what's historically happened is technology is built, it's conceptualized and built in the West, mostly in Silicon Valley, and then it's kind of like just sent out there, right? And you're not thinking about how people use it because culture essentially defines how people are using technology. So what we're seeing is people are developing their own thing. People are developing their own platforms. There are a lot of we did this story a few years ago. Dating apps for Muslim communities, even like very popular in countries like Saudi Arabia, right? There is this idea of like halal fintech in Indonesia, for example, right? So people are kind of like taking matter into their own hands and figuring out, okay, what does my community need, right? And how do I sort of build this for my community? And I think all of this innovation and problem solving that is happening outside Silicon Valley gives us a better chance of defining the future of everybody's technology experience. And that's what we want to be in the forefront of, like telling stories about that experience. And that gives me a lot of hope because we're seeing some really exciting stuff that's coming from these markets.
What about skills and job creation as the result of these amazing technologies sort of like developing or innovation?
What does job creation look like, you
Creation
mean?
look like, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Because
I mean, I think
like if you
yeah,
if you remember, 10 years ago, it was mostly about these call centers, right? So it sort of like
right.
seemed like that was the only thing South Asia was capable of hosting, and much of the innovation was happening in the West. Are you seeing that changing a little bit? Like, how does it, what does it look like in terms of job creation, but also in terms of like the tech pipeline?
Right. I mean, I think in multiple layers. I think gig work is like a very easy one. Obviously, there's a lot of I wouldn't even say controversy, but there is a lot of reporting on just the state of gig work and how people at these blue collar workers um, are not treated fairly, right? But if you look at places like Pakistan, places like India, places like Nepal, places like South Africa, people are able to earn an income where in the past they didn't have consistent incomes because of a lot of these, like whether it's ride-hailing platforms, delivery platforms, right? I think that whole sort of like job market thing has changed because the service industry has changed. And then there is just like the development as in terms of coding, right? Like the very technical nature of it. You could be anywhere and work for a tech company. I think COVID has changed some of this, but you could be an engineering graduate in Kathmandu. You could be an engineering graduate in Belarus, right? You could be a developer that's based in one of these places far away from Silicon Valley, and if you have the right sort of like skill set and stuff, you could be part of the global tech ecosystem. There's also a demand for these kind of like skill sets because there's so much like innovation that's happening. Um, I think the other thing is, I look at the creator economy. Like, I mean, more than even sort of a job creation is an opportunity to earn income, right? So you see, obviously, the influencer market, the influencer economy is also a contentious kind of like topic. But people are earning money in dollars by working in the creative industry, right? There was a time where it was dominated by you'd have to be a supermodel, or you would have to be an actor to do an advertising for a brand, and that whole thing has been disrupted actually. And you're seeing people who are living in these places earning money by posting on YouTube, by posting on Instagram, by posting on TikTok, and that's actually exciting for people in that thing because their lives have changed, right? They have
Right.
the ability to buy things. They have the ability to build homes. And that looks very different than what it was like 10 years ago.
Right. So, I'm in this business where, we sort of like talk about how development interventions or changes lives, right? Or technology changes lives. I guess my last question to you would be like, have you seen communities changing or societies changing because of technology? Like what does that look like for you from like in terms of like covering that or doing a story? Like, what does it mean when what does it look like when like communities and societies are changing because of technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's see. I'll try to think of like two examples. We one of the things we consistently cover at Rest of World is this idea of like online scams, digital scams, right? And very early on, I mean, one of the first stories we did on this was out of Kenya, where this app called Okash, which now I think is like part of a Chinese company, but was originally Nordic. Um, what Okash was doing was it was a micro lending sort of app, and it was operating in Kenya, very popular. And when people were falling behind on loans, it was going through your contact list and then sending a message, basically social shaming you and saying like you're falling behind in loans. And that, I mean, that led to suicides, like, that idea that like in communities like Kenya, in communities like India, in communities in a lot of these like communities, social sort of like status or like that community pride is like everything. So when you're kind of like taking advantage of that, right, and shaming people, that's kind of like the unintended consequence of technology, right? So that's one example. The other is like a story we did out of India, which was really exciting because a lot of fintech platforms have made payments very, very easy. You can pay through your phone, but then there is this, especially in places like India, the street markets or people who are selling stuff on the streets, like that's how local economy is run. So this one company, Paytm, I believe, launched a sound box, and that was like an incredible innovation because what it was doing was when you paid, it would say in Hindi or like in a local language that payment has been received. So the shopkeeper who may not actually like have access to a mobile device or understand English to say like payment confirmed, it just did that one simple thing. And it was great for the company because the subscriptions to that payment box increased, and it was great for the shopkeepers, Right? And I
Oh,
think these are just
wow.
like two very small kind of
Right.
like distinct examples, which is why like we said like we want to be in these places, we want to be in front of people, we want to see how people are adopting these technologies, for the better or for the worse.
Well, I just looked at my clock here and it tells me we're out of time. This has been such a fabulous conversation, Anup. Thank you so much for making the time. I learned a lot of things today, and I've sort of like been making notes to follow up on a couple more things. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. And before
Thank
I
you
sign
again.
off, yeah.
And no, thank you again for having me. And thank you to everybody tuning in. If you want to sort of like, hear more about these kind of stories, please go to restofworld.org.
And put it as your bookmark, as I have. So yeah, before I sign off, I wanted to remind everyone that we have an incredible lineup of speakers for the rest of the day and into Thursday: keynotes, lightning talks, breakout sessions, workshops, tech demos, networking sessions. Do stay with us and attend as many sessions as you can, and if you miss them, you can come back and visit them again and again. Happy GDDF.